everyone. I am so excited to be talking to H.W. Brands, and he is an author of this book, his most recent book, The General versus the President, but he has written more books than I can even count. So here's some of my books, not including audio and Kindle. So thank you so much, Bill.
Delighted, Joe.
Oh my gosh, I have been looking forward to this so much. My boyfriend and I, who are huge fans, we used to be like, on a Saturday night, do you want to watch a movie or should we watch Brands? And then you'd win a lot. Because we're both history buffs, so you are like our hero. And we were watching some of your videos, and the one year he said, for Christmas, he's like, just get me as many of his books as you can. Just, go on Amazon, buy as many as you can. And then we heard you talk about your biographies and how you set up, your biographies of the 6, I don't want to say presidents because there were only 5 of them, but that told the whole United States history, right?
Right.
So we made it our goal. We were going to read all 6 of them in 1 year.
Oh, all right.
And he won because I didn't finish Reagan.
Okay.
But as you guys, let me see if anybody can see why this is a difficult task. Look at this book, okay? This is just, and I couldn't find Franklin today, but, his was equally as large. So,
Yeah.
It was a good goal, but he won. So.
Okay.
But let's talk about you first before we get into MacArthur. And
Sure.
You are a history professor. You're at the University of Texas still, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, the amount of books you write, how do you have time to do both?
Well, I find that my writing and my teaching dovetail pretty well. For example, when I wrote the book about MacArthur and Truman, I knew the general outlines of the story because I had been teaching about the Korean War since I started teaching in the late 1970s. So when I decided to write a book focusing on these 2 men at this particular moment of the war, I probably knew 85% of what I needed to know to write a book. I have friends who are writers who are not teachers. And when they come up with a new project, they basically have to educate themselves from the ground up. Now, I have a huge head start on people who aren't teachers.
Right.
There's another way in which my teaching benefits my writing, and that is that for most writers, writing is this very solitary enterprise. And you spend a long time researching, writing, editing, copy editing, doing all the stuff that goes into making a book before you get any feedback. It's one of the reasons that authors are usually quite happy to do events at bookstores, to give lectures, to meet with readers, to see, well, how did you like it? Just last night, I was at a premiere of a new movie about Lyndon Johnson, and I was talking with
the one with Woody Harrelson.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah,
can't wait.
Yeah,
can't wait.
And I was talking with Woody Harrelson and Rob Reiner about this, and we sort of shared this similar attitude in that they spent a year or more making this movie, but they don't know how it works until they actually try it out on audiences. And the point of sitting in the audience to see what scenes, what lines the audience reacts to. Well, with me, I get the same thing with my students. Because when I was working on my book about Truman and MacArthur, every opportunity I would inject Truman and MacArthur into my classes. So if I needed an example of constitutional relations between the military and the civilian side of the government, and I would point out, well, this came up during the Korean War, when I would talk about how in American history, generals have often gone into politics. And I would mention that Douglas MacArthur ran for president 3 times, never made it to the presidency, but in fact he lost the last time in 1952 to Dwight Eisenhower, another general. So I get a chance to try out my ideas. I also get a chance to try out scenes. So there are moments in the book when Truman is interacting with his advisors and they're trying to figure out what to do about MacArthur. And I'll try these out on my students. And the students that I teach, some of them are history majors, but most of them are not. So these are students who are like a general readership like the people that I'm writing for, people who don't have to read my books, where, I mean, they can put these down. You know, they don't all have this pre-existing interest in history. And so I have to come up with stories. I have to come up with aspects of the broader tale that keep them engaged. And when you're lecturing to a group of 19-year-olds, you can tell pretty quickly when you're losing them. Their eyes wander. They sneak down to their phones, and you can see their thumbs going under the desk. So for me, far from teaching interfering with my writing time, the teaching actually complements and strengthens my writing.
Right. That's awesome. And, you know, before I started reading this book, I had read Truman a long time ago, and then, you know, David McCullough's book, and then saw the movie. But I felt like I really learned a lot more, maybe because I'm older now. I don't know. I'm paying attention a little bit more. But I learned a lot about him that I felt like I didn't know then. And then I was born in 1964, so, you know, the Korean War is before my time. And then I was thinking, you know what? I bet people my age, the only thing we know about the Korean War is MASH.
Right.
Know?
And the odd thing about MASH is, although it's set in the Korean War, it's really about Vietnam, because the kinds of things that the characters do on MASH are exactly what they were doing in Vietnam. They didn't do that kind of stuff in the Korean War, but it was just a convenient way of displacing the story. But you've actually identified something that is very interesting to me as a teacher and a writer. And you said that you had a greater appreciation of Truman the second time around when you came back. This is one of the things that I find to be very common with history, that people gain a greater appreciation for history the older they are, and really sort of the more life experience they have. It's also the case that, like many things in life, you have to be exposed to it 2 or 3 times before its meaning really sinks in. And again, so I lecture to 2 separate groups primarily. They're my 19-year-old students, and then when I lecture to general audiences, the ones who just come on their own, I would say their average age is 70.
Right,
because these are people who very often are retired. They've got time. So I lecture in continuing education programs at the University of Texas where I teach. And these are basically for retired people. When I do book events, very often, it's people who are retired. And so I get this striking contrast between the 19-year-olds and the 70-year-olds. And almost without fail, when I finish one of my lectures to the older audiences, somebody will come up and say, boy, if I had had a professor like you when I was 19, I would have paid more attention. And my usual response is, well, probably you did, but you were 19.
Right.
Because when you're 19, you're not naturally tuned to history. It's the rare 19-year-old who is interested in looking back. When you're 19, you're supposed to be looking forward. And that's perfectly natural and appropriate. When you're 70, it's more natural to be looking back. There's not that much more to look forward to.
Well, that's really, you know, I homeschooled. I have 6 children, and I homeschooled all of them. And they would say that to me when we get to history. Can we just skip history? Why do we have to do that? And their argument always was like, give me one good reason why I should know what happened before. You know, so kids generally don't care until they get older. Now my kids are older, and they're like, oh, you know that history you taught us? That was really good. Because I'm like, it's a very interesting thing.
The way I approach this with my students and sort of implicitly with my readers is, I don't tell them that you need to know this. I don't say that this is something that is going to change your life. I just start telling them a story. I start telling them this, for example, in my history class now, we're dealing with the emergence of democracy in America. So I tell them about Andrew Jackson and his wife, Rachel, and how it started out as an illicit love affair.
Right.
And with 19-year-olds, as with a lot of people, you start telling them a story about the sex lives of your characters, and you hook them. And the same thing is true with my books. When I was writing primarily for an academic audience, I would write in a more academic form, where in an introduction or a preface, I would say that these are the themes of the book, and these are the things to be looking for, and this is the essential argument I make. But I became aware fairly quickly that general readers don't care about themes. They don't care about arguments. Tell me a story.
Right.
So my books still do have themes, but the themes are embedded in the stories. And I only really highlight the themes at the end, which is exactly where it should be. If you lead with your theme, then the first thing you do is you risk putting off your reader on page 3 because, no, I just want to know the good stuff. I want to know the stories. But secondly, the themes should emerge from the story rather than being imposed upon the story. And so, again, as with my students in class, I have this goal when I'm writing to give something on every page so that the reader is enough interested to turn to the next page. Because you held up the book on Teddy Roosevelt. That book is 900 pages long. And no person in his or her right mind is going to sit down and say, boy, 900, I've been wanting to read 900 pages on Teddy. But if I just get them from page 1 to page 2, and then from page 2 to page 3, and then and so on, eventually the book will end. And I will tell you that I cherish, I like all of the emails that I get from readers. They're almost all positive. People who don't like my stuff usually don't bother to write.
Right.
So most of the emails that I get from readers are positive, but the ones that I really cherish and the ones that I save to use with my editor are the ones that say, really liked your book on TR. The only thing wrong with it was too short. And so if somebody tells me that my 900-page book is too short, I save that. So when my editor says, okay, Bill, on this next project, maybe you should cut it by about 10%. Then I'll send them a few of these. I'll say, no, the readers want it longer. Because my thinking is, and I think this is borne out by what readers tell me, that if they like a book at 600 pages, they're going to love it at 900 pages. They get more for their money.
Exactly. And when I saw this book, I was like, this doesn't even seem like one of his books. It's so short.
Let me tell you about that, because after you referred to the 6 biographies that I wrote, yes. And they were designed to be a history of the United States in 6 volumes, but I bootlegged it under the design of biographies. Because while a lot of people, like you mentioned, your children say, history is boring, why do we have to learn it? A lot of people have sort of unfortunate or unhappy memories of history classes. Nobody has unfortunate, unhappy memories of biography classes because there are no biography classes. Right. But furthermore, biographies are the genre of nonfiction. They're closest to the novel because they're the ones who get you most deeply inside the subject's head. So I figured I could write this history of the United States, but cast it in the form of biographies. So when people pick up my Benjamin Franklin book, I don't tell them up front that what they're getting is a history of how the American colonies became the American nation, the United States of America. It's implicit in the title, if you're paying attention, the first American. Benjamin Franklin was born an Englishman but died an American. And so the question for the book, and one of the things that I tell my writing students, is that anything that you write has to have in it some question to be answered. Now, the genre of fiction that places front and center is the murder mystery. We've got this body, who did it? But everything that we write should be driven by something that I want to know or something that I want to share. So with the book on Franklin, it's this question of how did Benjamin Franklin, loyal Englishman, become Benjamin Franklin, revolutionary American? That's the story. And with each of the biographies, there's a similar kind of task. But after I finished writing the biographies, in the first place, I will confess that even my Reagan biography, which is the last one, is 700 pages. And, oh man, that's a lot of heavy lifting. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that one again. But the other thing was that when you write a biography, you're pretty well committed to going birth to death and including everything that happened in there. Right. But in any life, even the most interesting, there are times when when the plot kind of slows down. Right. And so you wish, do I really have to write about that? When you're writing a biography, well, you sort of do. The reason that the Teddy Roosevelt biography was the longest was that he did the most interesting stuff, sort of from beginning to end. But with Ronald Reagan, there were a decade of Reagan's life in the 1950s that weren't that interesting. He was doing the same stuff day after day, and I could cover it in a relatively short chapter. So I thought, all right, after these biographies, I'm going to change the format a little bit. I still like writing about people. I don't do well writing social history. Mm-hmm. histories of sort of grand movements and the like. No, I need to have people, identifiable people. But I thought instead of one protagonist, and when you write about one protagonist, when you write a biography, you lend the impression, you really can't avoid giving the impression, that the world revolves around your subject. Now, as important as your subject might be, I wrote about 5 presidents of the United States. These are pretty important people. But the world does not revolve around Ronald Reagan or Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt or Ulysses Grant. And so I wanted to get away from that. The second thing was that when you write a biography, the world is seen through this individual's eyes. You can bring in outside characters, but they're always clearly outsiders, and they don't get equal treatment. So what I wanted was a story where 2 powerful personalities clash, and I would be able to set it up so I could do justice to each personality. One of the things that I have always tried to do in my writing, my biographies as well, is to not bias things in favor of my subject. I try to do justice to them, but I don't. When I was writing about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, I made a point of not saying that the New Deal was a good deal or that it was a bad deal. I did make a point that it was a big deal, and you, dear reader, should understand why it was a big deal, but you can form your own views as to whether you liked it or you didn't. Well, when I wrote about Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur, I take great pains not to side with either one. And so that readers can choose their own. And also it sort of keeps the drama going. How is this going to turn out? Who's going to win? Because I'm not sure that, most readers who pick up a book on the Korean War are going to know that Harry Truman was president and that Douglas MacArthur was a general. And a lot of them will know that eventually MacArthur gets fired. And that's the way this conflict is resolved. And so of course, that's one of the challenges of writing history, where, okay, you know that the South lost the Civil War. So how do you make that dramatic? Well, somebody posed the question to James Cameron when he was directing Titanic. Right. And he said, come on, we all know the ship goes down. But you can still bring human personality into that happening. And in fact, that can actually lend to the drama. So I've written about the Texas Revolution, including the Battle of the Alamo. Now, one thing everybody knows about the Battle of the Alamo is that they all died. Right. Still, you can make it dramatic precisely because we know they're going to die. Because the thing that makes the Alamo, I think, such a compelling tale, and one that is retold again and again, is that in our own lives, and one of the reasons we read is to find out if there's anybody out there like me. We all go through some of the same things, whether you read fiction or nonfiction, whether you read poetry, whatever it is. And with the Battle of the Alamo, we all know that one day we will die. And at one time or another, we sort of think, well, how will I deal with approaching death? With the Alamo, there are these 200 men inside. We know they're going to die. Gradually, they become aware that they are going to die. So how do they handle themselves? Right. Of course, in the case of the Alamo, one of the things that's so intriguing is we don't exactly know, precisely because they all did die, and none are left to tell their story. Exactly. And this is why, it lends itself both to drama. There have been numerous movies made about the Alamo, but also for writers of nonfiction history. So I can surmise what William Travis must have been thinking. Anyway, so I decided to write this book about 2 people clashing. There's one last thing on this, and that is that the mystery crime writer Elmore Leonard, who died a few years ago, he used to write drafts of his new novels, and his first reader was always his wife. And so he'd give her a draft of the new book, and she would read it, and she would always come back with the same comment written on the title page. And the comment was, "Get rid of the boring stuff." Well, I think that this is great advice for any writer. Right. So write at great length, write the whole thing, and then go back and get rid of the boring stuff. In choosing to write about Truman and MacArthur, I didn't choose to write about their whole lives. I just focused on the most dramatic moment, the most telling moment in each of their lives. So I've got these 2 opposing figures, and I focus on this one particular moment in their lives. That's why the book is skinny.
Well, my son who edits this video, I have two sons that are vets, okay? And my first son was a Marine, and he's 30 now, and he edits these videos. And then my second son went to Iraq. He's 28, and he's a vet.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so I'm telling him about this interview, and I'm like, what do you know about the Korean War? Because they're both history, and they're both into, And he said, Mom, I never told you my Korea story, because I wasn't allowed to, but now I can tell you. He was stationed in Japan, and they said to them, we're going away for 24 hours, and, we're not telling you where. So they land in South Korea. He doesn't know he's in South Korea, but they finally tell him. And he gets to go up to the gate of North Korea and South Korea.
Yeah.
And look at the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was really cool, but scary.
Yeah.
But cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
he doesn't have to go back.
Right. He said, Mom, they're pointing missiles at each other. Trust me. Yeah. Okay? And they stare at each other all day.
I'll bet. Yeah.
So anyway, I found this book fascinating. I did not know anything about this time period. And as a military mom and a military wife who's lived on Andrews Air Force Base, okay, I am a president person. I love the president. I don't care who they are. I have some political, but really I just love the president, okay? But I love the general.
Yeah.
So I was conflicted. I wanted them both to be right.
Good, because I intended you to be. Precisely because there is a very strong argument to be made for the position of both of them.
Right.
And they both made their arguments very well. MacArthur is a compelling figure. He is one of the most remarkable soldiers ever to wear the American uniform. He was personally brave. He had every decoration that the U.S. and several other countries could give. He was brilliant. There was no question about that. He was also insufferably arrogant. He was very persuasive. The people who loved MacArthur thought the world of him. They thought he walked on water. But the striking thing is, I've appreciated this more after the book has been out. And I speak to groups that include Korean War veterans and also the occasional World War II vet.
Right.
And among the rank and file, Douglas MacArthur was widely despised because he seemed to be a glory hound, especially in World War II. And ever since then, there are generals who are known as GIs generals, the ones who are looking out for their troops first and foremost. And whenever there's a victory, they make sure that they give the credit to the troops, the ones who actually did the fighting and the dying. MacArthur was the other way around. MacArthur would take personal credit for this stuff. He was undeniably brilliant. There's no question about that. And he accomplished things by his administration, for example, of Japan. He almost single-handedly remade Japan into a modern liberal democracy. And almost nobody else could have done that. But he wasn't by any means a GI's general. And so the American people loved MacArthur. They thought he was the greatest thing ever. And after Truman fired him, MacArthur came home to ticker tape parades. And he thought he was going to be the next president of the United States. Didn't work out that way. It was another general, right. Dwight Eisenhower. But he was, and when I was writing the different sections of the book, I would find myself, when writing about MacArthur, think, he's making a lot of sense. And then I would write the opposite point of view from Truman and say, well, that makes a lot of sense too. And one of the reasons I chose this book and this subject is precisely because the hard questions that our country faces are close calls. Is it this or is it that? The ones that aren't close calls are relatively easy questions, and we come to a resolution. But the basic question that MacArthur and Truman were having was, how does the United States deal with communism at the moment that the communist side has developed nuclear weapons? And this was an argument that would go on for 40 years. One of the reasons that Harry Truman is a compelling character, because if you just measure the two side by side, MacArthur has much greater gifts of intelligence, of presence, of leadership ability. But Harry Truman kind of grows on you. He's just this ordinary guy. He's the underdog president. Yes. But he also turned out to be the one that history vindicated. Harry Truman left office in 1953, the most unpopular president ever. And his popularity remained very low for 20, 30 years after that. He really only came to reach the ranks of the greatest president. He's now in the top 5 or 6 of presidents. Only because the Cold War, which Harry Truman was the first president to fight, was won on American terms, actually on Harry Truman's terms, 40 years after he did it. And, if it takes 40 years for your policies to pay off, usually in politics, you don't get credit for it. Things have gone far past you. But you mentioned the book by David McCulloch on Harry Truman. That book came out just after the end of the Cold War, when Truman seemed to be this guy, you know what? Long ago, he got it right. Exactly. Every president who leaves office under a cloud, under criticism, hopes to be the next Harry Truman. George W. Bush is waiting his turn.
But you know what? I saw an interview with him recently with on the Today Show and with Matt Lauer, and he was actually like talking to him so nice, and I was like, oh my God, it's going to come around. People are going to start hailing, and I'm wondering if it's going to happen again. I hope I live long.
Well, it will in a certain sense, because the nature of politics has corroded so much in the almost 20 years since George W. Bush ran for president.
Right.
That just the fact that whatever you make of his policies, everybody agrees he's a decent man. He's the kind of person you could introduce your kids to without having to apologize. And, so the nature of politics today is such that a lot of parents have a hard time saying, son, daughter, I want you to grow up to be like some figure in politics. Whereas nobody has a problem saying, if you grow up to be like George W. Bush, or even more his father, the Bush family is an honorable family in American politics. They take politics and governance seriously. And it's really easy to draw the conclusions today that a lot of people in politics don't take governance seriously. They like the spectacle, they like the controversy, but they just can't get their act together to make the decisions for the country.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. I am thrilled, okay? This has been a dream of mine since I started doing this, and this is your new book. Are you working on anything that you can talk about before you go?
I am working on something else, but I'm not prepared to talk about it just yet.
This came out in 2016, and I know you, okay?
And paperback is just out, too. So.
Right, and I know you'll have another one very soon for us. So thank you so much, Bill. You have a great day.
My pleasure, Michelle. You too.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye.